The final dish. Elena was a chef renowned for her daring dishes. She had trained under the world's best and prided herself on pushing boundaries, blending flavors, and venturing into culinary realms few others dared to. But for years there had been one dish she had always wanted to make, a dish spoken of only in whispers among chefs, shrouded in legend. Some called it the final dish, a recipe so ancient and secretive that it had been passed down only in fragments, with each chef adding something of their own. It was said to be the pinnacle of culinary mastery, and those who tasted it would experience flavors so intense they could barely endure them. But there was also a darker side to the legend. Chefs who attempted the final dish were said to disappear. It was as if they had poured everything of themselves into the dish, leaving nothing behind. Elena had heard these stories from her mentor, Chef Delacroix, a man who had once been revered as the greatest chef in France before he mysteriously vanished one night. He had spoken of the final dish only once, and his words had stuck with her ever since. It's the greatest creation, but it takes something from you. Something you can never get back. For years, Elena resisted the temptation, focusing instead on her restaurant, her legacy. But as time wore on, she felt an insatiable pull to try. She found herself haunted by the thought of it, day and night, until finally she decided she would prepare the final dish. She believed she could handle it. She was one of the best after all. Elena scoured old libraries, reading rare cookbooks and consulting the few chefs who might know of the recipe. Most dismissed her or refused to speak of it. But then late one night, an anonymous note arrived at her doorstep. Scrawled in an unsteady hand it read, "The ingredients will reveal themselves. Prepare yourself for more than you can taste. Midnight. October 31st. The message left her unnerved, but she felt a strange thrill. It was October 28th, so she had 3 days to gather her courage. She didn't sleep that night, lying in bed, thinking of what might await her. When October 31st arrived, she prepared her kitchen meticulously. She sharpened her knives, laid out her finest cookware, and set up an array of spices and herbs. Just as the clock struck midnight, she felt an odd sensation, like an icy finger trailing down her spine. Her kitchen lights flickered, and when they steadied, she found a small black-bound book on her countertop. She didn't remember bringing it there. On its cover, in silver letters, were the words "The Final Dish." With trembling hands she opened the book. Inside was a list of ingredients, each more unusual and unsettling than the last. It called for things like sorrow's root, veins of the earth, and heart of ash. Elena frowned, assuming these were poetic names for exotic ingredients. But as she gathered her tools and set to work, the ingredients seemed to manifest themselves. Reaching into her spice drawer, she found a shriveled root she didn't remember buying, one that emitted a faint, mournful hum. It was sorrow's root. She ran her fingers over the stone countertops, feeling them pulse and throb, and when she looked closer she found thin, silvery veins embedded in the stone itself. She chipped a few fragments and set them aside, knowing somehow that they were veins of the earth. The most unsettling ingredient was the heart of ash. She had no idea what it could be, and as she looked around her kitchen, her gaze fell on her own reflection in the oven door. In the flickering kitchen light she looked pale, almost ghostly. Her reflection's hand moved to her chest, and in a trance, Elena reached out, mirroring the gesture. For a moment, her fingers felt something cold and hard just beneath her skin, pressing against her ribcage. She shook herself out of the daze and forced herself to look away. When she glanced back, she saw a small, grayish stone on the countertop, faintly warm to the touch. It was as if a part of her had been taken from her body and left there. Disturbed but determined, she moved forward, carefully combining the ingredients. The process was unlike any she'd ever encountered. She was used to precise measurements, clear steps, and predictable flavors, but this felt alive. Every ingredient pulsed, every mixture hummed, and as she stirred, the aroma that filled the kitchen was intoxicating yet disturbing. A blend of earthy bitterness and something metallic, almost like blood. Hours passed, the world outside still and dark. Elena felt herself growing weaker with every step. Her hands trembled as she diced and stirred, her vision blurred, and her thoughts became scattered. Yet she felt compelled to keep going, her mind filled with fragments of her past, memories she hadn't thought of in years. Her first dish as a young chef, the face of her mentor, her mother's smile. Finally, as the first light of dawn crept through the window, the dish was ready. It was a simple-looking plate, a small mound of something dark, almost black, with a rich, velvety sauce. The aroma was both tantalizing and sickening, filling her with an intense mixture of dread and anticipation. She placed the dish in front of her and picked up a fork, hesitating. Her hands felt numb, and her mind raced with a sudden fear. What if this was too much? What if the stories were true? But she had come this far. She took a small bite, the taste exploding in her mouth. It was unlike anything she had ever experienced, sweet and bitter, sharp and smooth, with layers of flavors that twisted and morphed, each one dragging her deeper into her own mind. She tasted sorrow, joy, terror, love, every emotion, every memory she had ever experienced. And with each bite, more memories surfaced, moments she thought she had forgotten. And then she felt herself slipping away. Her vision dimmed, the kitchen around her fading into darkness, and she realized too late that she could no longer move. The fork fell from her hand, clattering on the plate, but she couldn't reach for it. She was trapped, her body frozen, yet her mind continued to spiral, her memories unraveling like threads pulled from a tapestry. She tried to scream, but no sound came. Moments, hours, or perhaps years later, Elena felt herself standing in her kitchen once again. But something was wrong. Her hands looked faint, almost translucent. She looked down, and to her horror, she saw herself lying slumped over the table, eyes vacant, her hand still reaching for the fork. The door to her kitchen creaked open, and a young chef, a stranger she didn't recognize, stepped inside. She watched, powerless, as he glanced around in confusion. His gaze fell on the black-bound book on the counter, and he picked it up, his eyes lighting with intrigue. She wanted to scream, to warn him, to tell him to leave. But as she tried to move, she felt the kitchen pull at her, binding her to the walls, to the floor, to the very air. She was part of it now, like the hundreds of other chefs who had dared to make the final dish and had lost themselves to its dark magic. And as she watched the young chef leaf through the book, she heard a faint, mournful whisper, her own voice joining the countless others who were now trapped, forever bound to the legend of the final dish. The young chef paused, hearing something strange in the silence of the kitchen. But then he shook his head, thinking it was only his imagination, and continued reading, unaware that he was already walking down the same dark path. And somewhere in the shadows, Elena watched, waiting, knowing she would never leave, cursed to be the kitchen's silent witness to each new, unsuspecting chef who dared to try the final dish.